Well, a very good morning to you all who are joining us from any part around the globe. It's 7 a.m. in London here in the UK. It should be very late in the evening for John Keane in Sydney. Welcome, John, and welcome all those people who are joining us today. So before we jump into the discussion, I would like to give you an introduction. Of course, John Keane does not need an introduction. It's the topic of our discussion is about democracy, about which John Keane has extensively written about over the past few decades. And I think it doesn't let go of him. He's going to take it with him for the rest of his life. So I'm going to very quickly go into the introduction. This is what you will find, but I'll probably add a few things here and there myself. So John Keane is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney. He was born in Southern Australia, and he's also a professor of politics at Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. He first studied politics and government and history at the University of Adelaide, winning the Tin Lion Prize for first-class honors with highest distinction in 1971. He was a Commonwealth Fellowship he won a Commonwealth Fellowship to study at the University of Toronto, where in the fields of philosophy and political economy, he was awarded a doctorate and mentored and supervised by C.B. Macpherson. He later held a post-doctoral fellowship at King's College at the University of Cambridge, where he worked closely with Anthony Giddens, Quentin Skinner, and other leading scholars. So John Keane is a globally renowned scholar for his creative thinking about democracy. Well before the European revolutions of 1989, John Keane first came to public prominence as a theorist and defender of civil society. And he wrote at that time in opposition to in Central Eastern Europe, and throughout the 1980s, he contributed extensively to the program of flying university apartment seminars in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. His political and scholarly writing during that period was published under the pen name Erika Blair. And now I can go on with this introduction. You will find them all there, so I don't want to make it too colorful and take too much of our time today. We are going to talk today about the latest book in a series of books on democracy that John Keane has been writing, and the topic of the book is the shortest history of democracy. And I'm pretty confident that in a couple of years there will be another shorter version of democracy, because we're going to come up with new issues around democracy. So if I may ask John Keane to please unmute himself, and I'll pass the floor on to John Keane. And then once John finishes talking about the book, I will come in with a few questions. And if participants from around the globe can join us, I could also bring in questions from the field. Thank you. You're welcome, John Keane, please.
Well, thank you very much. Merci. Salam, Dariush. Good morning to you, and good evening to those who are further to the east. It is around early evening here in Sydney on a rather nice summer's day amidst a pestilence. I want, just in the space of, let's say, 15 minutes, I want to say a few things give you a thumbnail sketch of this little book called The Shortest History of Democracy, which this week was published here in Australia. It is forthcoming in the UK and in the United States. So far already 12 translations have been commissioned, not in Farsi yet. And I want to give you a flavor of this book, which is indeed the shortest ever written, so far as I know, in any language that I know. The book tries to breathe life into a word which has become a zombie word. Everybody is a Democrat. Putin, Xi Jinping, the prime ministers of Canada and Australia, Boris Johnson, and so on. It also tries to encourage readers to dig their heels in about why it is that the bowdlerization of the word, rendering it a cliche, an overused cliche, why it is that actually it's a precious word that has very significant meaning and political ramifications in these years of the 21st century. The book is a history. Why write a history, a very short history of a couple of 100 pages of democracy? Well, the book opens with some reasons for why history is important. The old rule applies. Those who are ignorant of the past inevitably misunderstand the present and misjudge possible futures. One point that used to open the book is that democracies are passing through their deepest crisis since the 1920s and 30s, but it is not a replay of that moment. To understand that point requires getting some historical sense. Democracy in historical form, writing about a history, also unsettles old orthodoxies. You will find when you look at this book, which I hope you do, that the case is made for the archaeological fact that democracy, understood as self-governing assemblies of equals, is not a Greek invention. It is not an Athenian, a product of Athens. It has actually, thanks to some archaeologists, it has Eastern roots. For example, in the cities of Syria-Mesopotamia, some 2,000 years earlier than democracy appeared in the Greek world. This book also pursues a history because it tries to pluralize our sense of the history of democracy, to see that it can be seen in a variety of ways. At one point, I quote the great French scholar Nicole Leroux, who said that the real challenge is to write a history of democracy democratically. That is what I have tried to do, to say that democracy does not require memory police. Indeed, it goes further to say that one of the dangers throughout the history of democracy is that those who are opposed to it have tried to write its history. There is a remark in the book by Goebbels, who said that the biggest joke about democracy, Goebbels, of course, was the minister of propaganda under Hitler. The biggest joke about democracy, said Goebbels, is that it offers its critics who want to destroy it the means of destruction of democracy by providing, for example, freedom of assembly. So there's always a grave danger that democracy will be forgotten or misrepresented seriously by one point of view. This book is a remembrance of heroes and heroines who I try to encourage you to see are motivators. You know, these are people who did extraordinary things under very difficult conditions in defense of what came to be called democracy. Least obvious in the opening pages of the book, why history really matters to democracy is the claim that I make that democracy makes history possible. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you think about democracy, its spirit, as the spirit of equality of living beings on planet Earth, if you think about democracy as the self-government of flesh and blood people who consider themselves to be equals and entitled to dignity, to freedom, to joining with others in solidarity to decide how they are going to live on the earth, then democracy is not only the opponent of all forms of concentrated power, tyranny, oligarchy, totalitarianism, monarchy, and so on. But democracy, when it takes root among people and within, so to say, their bellies, it encourages them to see that inequities of power, that the way things currently are not necessarily what they have to be in the future. To put it a bit philosophically, democracy is the friend of contingency. By that I mean that it loosens up people to see that the conditions in which they're living are not natural. They're not necessarily God-given. The way things are not necessarily the way things will be in future. And that spirit runs through this book. It's a theme that is very central to the whole book. Democracy has a wild quality, I say, and I try to illustrate this through sketches, for example, of characters like Francisco Madero. Madero was an opponent of corrupted elections in Mexico towards the end of the 19th century. He committed himself to the reform of elections and to democracy. He considered democracy a whole way of life. He went all the way. He actually won the presidential elections in the early 20th century in Mexico. He was only 37, one of the youngest presidents ever in the history of Mexico, with over 90% of the vote, and was rewarded with a bullet in the head of his back overnight with the complicity of the American ambassador. Or Muriel Matters, a woman from my native South Australia who traveled to Britain, who is the first woman to ever have given a speech in the House of Commons at the Palace of Westminster. She did so from the speakers, from the public gallery. She chained herself to the metal railings. She delivered a speech in support of the right of women to vote. Such were the times that she padlocked herself to the metal grill, placed the key down her knickers. Given norms of that period, a blacksmith had to be called, the grill had to be cut. She was carried with the grill down, chained to the grill, down onto the streets where she was arrested and duly imprisoned. This book contains, I hope you will see, numerous surprises. For example, in accordance with that renegade, wild quality of democracy. Why is it, the book asks in the opening section, that democracy notoriously unfriendly towards women until quite recently has always been represented as a woman, a la Salah, in the Sudanese uprising against the military dictatorship recently, became a representative of that democratic uprising. Democracy as a woman appeared in the Hong Kong uprisings in the last decade. She appeared, of course, as a statue in Tiananmen Square. Going back in time, the book points out she was represented, for example, by Cesare Ripa, an Italian iconographer in the 16th century, as a peasant woman holding a pomegranate, a symbol of the people, and snakes in her other hand. And of course, democracy appeared as a woman in one of the most famous relics of Athenian democracy in the 330s, BCE. There is a stone carving, still today you can see it in Athens, of democracy as a woman crowning old man Demos. So that's briefly some reasons why, and a rather long-winded set of reasons why history really matters when thinking about democracy. So what does the book have to say about its history? Roughly and bluntly put, the book sketches three historical phases of democracy. What I call assembly democracy, electoral democracy, and monitory democracy. Let me say something about each of these historical phases. They are not discrete phases. You know, the locomotive of democracy does not stop at a station. That is the end of an historical period. People get off and, so to say, join the next train in the next phase. These phases are overlapping. And yet, the categories that I try to develop in this book are designed to heighten the sense that democracy underwent several fundamental paradigm shifts. It went through reimaginings in its history. Phase one, I call assembly democracy. I've mentioned that it has roots in ancient Syria, Mesopotamia, in cities like Babylon and Nippur and Lhasa. It is to a Danish archaeologist called Thorkild Jacobsen, who did his diggings in this area, that we owe the insight to the fact that assemblies were part of an important part of these cities of ancient Syria, Mesopotamia. They were later transported further to the west, to what is today India and Pakistan. Assemblies were transported, for example, through the Phoenicians to the west, into the Greek world, where the Greeks had the cheek to claim them as their own invention. What did democracy mean in this period? In this age of assembly democracy, it meant self-government of the people. People who consider each other as equals. Democracy is a form of power sharing. It is infused with the spirit of equality. Things are decided in public assemblies through a show of hands, or perhaps stones placed in a pot. In this period, democracy had a tremendous influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it gave rise, of course, to the most powerful state in the Eastern Mediterranean, namely Athens. What the book tries to show is that the very language of democracy has pre-classical Greek roots, words that are part of the family of terms that come to be called demokratia are found, for example, in the language of Linear B in the Mycenaean civilization. But it's throughout this period that democracy means public assemblies, government, self-government through public assemblies. An important historical shift begins to happen in the European region from the mid-medieval period through to roughly the 1920s and 1930s. This is the phase of what I call electoral democracy. To put it simply, democracy comes to be redefined. Yes, it remains the self-government of people, citizens who consider themselves to be equals of one another, but the central core mechanism of this new form of democracy is free and fair periodic elections. This was a revolution in the way that democracy was understood. It is recorded well in all kinds of documents and historical events. What I tried to say in this book is that electoral or representative democracy actually has medieval roots. It's even possible that the whole idea of representation, the idea that people elect a representative who then governs on their behalf for a fixed a period and then is called back, so to say, into their ranks. That idea potentially has roots in the Islamic world. For example, in the whole notion of the wakil, someone who is chosen to represent one's business or legal interests at a distance. I tried to show that the democracy that I call electoral democracy had a much older roots and very disparate origins. For example, the first parliament is not the British Parliament, as Westminsterites like often to claim. It happened actually in northern Spain in the town of Leon in 1188 under a king named Alfonso IX. It's the first recorded parliament of representatives who meet to decide things on behalf of their constituents. There are many innovations that fed into the idea of electoral democracy. For example, liberty of the press. It's associated with writers who made the case for a free press like John Milton. In Scotland, there was the Covenant movement. You know, the idea is that God-fearing Protestants would not give away their rights to political rulers unless those political rulers had the consent of their constituents, unless there was a covenant between the people and those who ruled, which implied, of course, that the people could overturn, they could overthrow their rulers. That is, the whole idea of covenants is a Scottish invention. I can go on. The book describes and reflects upon the way that electoral democracy, at the very point at which the right to vote, one person, one vote, is achieved at that very moment, immediately after World War I, during the 1920s and 30s, falls into a very deep crisis. In 1941, there were only 11 electoral democracies left on the face of the earth. 2 global wars, totalitarianism, dictatorship, an economic crisis. These factors helped drag down electoral democracy. It was plagued by contradictions, for example, between a private property system, capitalism, and the principle that the people are entitled to own the means of decision-making in common. That tension was proved to be a very deep source of crisis for electoral democracy in the 1920s and 30s. This was a period, of course, in which war was highly destructive of the spirit of democracy. This period saw the growth, the rebirth of monarchies, so-called purple tyranny, such as in Yugoslavia under King Alexander. There were armed dictatorships that acted in the name of the people, Pilsudski in Poland, and of course, totalitarianism in Japan, in Italy, and in Germany. So the period of electoral democracy ended unhappily. Third phase, the times in which we are now living, I call monitory democracy. I want to say just a few things about this third historical phase of democracy, while acknowledging that the history which is under our noses is always the most difficult to make sense of. This book wants to say that this is not well described as the age of liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama's End of History, the belief that American-style liberal democracy has now become globally dominant, is incorrect. It challenges Sam Huntington, an American scholar's thesis about the third wave of democracy. It suggests, this part of the book, that we are not returning to the age of deliberative assembly democracy. Something new was born a generation ago, and I spend some time in the book trying to detail what happened. The story, to put it very simply and in the briefest possible way, is that in the 1940s, when democracy, electoral democracy, was on its knees, was a period of dark energy, meaning a rejuvenation of the spirit of democracy happened, a reimagining of democracy happened, so that democracy came to mean in the 1940s and thereafter until today, nothing less than free and fair periodic elections, but something much more. And the something much more is the birth and the growth of many scores of watchdog, barking dog institutions, public scrutiny, public accountability mechanisms, public monitoring of power mechanisms that never existed before in the history of democracy. The birth of human rights networks, workplace co-determination. It first happened, these two first happened in the 1940s, workplace co-determination in Germany, in German factories. Participatory budgeting, the whole idea that people are entitled to scrutinize in between elections, local government budgets, for instance, and to have a say in how that budget is drawn up and allocated is a Brazilian invention. We have future generations commissions. One of them exists in Wales, whose job is to monitor present day demographic trends, social trends, and to keep alive a public discussion about the future unborn generations. Truth and reconciliation bodies, famously publicized in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Coral reef monitoring networks, investigative journalism across borders. I mean, these are all examples, very often unelected, examples of bodies and networks whose job is to scrutinize exercises of power, to prevent arbitrary power, to prevent bossing and bullying by the powerful, to blow the whistle on the powerful, and to do so by informing a wider public that abuses of power are a danger to their daily lives. Why did it happen? Why did democracy morph in the 1940s into a new historical form, for which we have no good name, but which I have tried to call monitory democracy, from the Latin monere, to warn, to admonish, is the original meaning in Latin of this word. And the root of it, these roots, I try to build in to the very conception of democracy as free and fair elections plus public monitory and restraint, tempering of power. Why did it happen? Well, there were no single causes or causes. It certainly happened against the backdrop of the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century. In the book, I detail the mood swing that happened in the 1940s and 50s globally, in India, in the Republic of China until 1949, in the European region and in Latin America. A mood swing that began to see that the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century that finished off electoral democracy were traceable to abuses of power, to predatory power, and that the main political problem, so this reimagining of democracy supposed and implied in practice, that the main problem is to prevent in politics secretive, foolish abuse of power, and that democracy is the best weapon we have for doing exactly that. Obviously, the digital network communications revolution has given a great boost, despite all the dark trends, to monitory democracy. You can see that movements, social movements, and some political parties have also helped reshape democracy. One of the unusual, historically speaking, features of monitory democracy is the way, in my lifetime, there's been a greening of democracy. It's promoted the idea that democracy is not only self-government of people who consider themselves to be equals and who cannot stomach arbitrary abuses of power, but democracy also means including the biosphere in human affairs, enabling its representation in human affairs, for example, through green parties, through global agreements, through citizen science experiments, through climate strikes, through initiatives like Extinction Rebellion, through bioregional assemblies, through legal rulings that give a legal status to the biosphere. In Slovenia, the right to clean drinking water is a citizen's right. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, whole patches of land have been granted legal rights, legal entitlements in human affairs, and so on. Will this form of democracy, monitory democracy, survive? I want to end, if I may, just with a couple of remarks about the times through which we're living. There are a lot of negative trends: environmental vandalism, a sense of cascading crises, floods, bushfires, for example, coalescing to threaten our human species. New forms of war of the kind unfolding in Ukraine at this point. A drift towards centralized power. The age of presidentialism is upon us. The decline of social solidarity, the disintegration of civil societies. In Argentina, 40% of the population lives in shantytown poverty. 60% of its children live under those conditions. There is the feeling that parties and politicians and parliaments and whole governments are corrupt. A new populism is on the rise. In the name of the people, demagogues try to get their way and typically have damaging anti-democratic effects. And of course, geopolitically, one thing that is striking is the birth of a new Chinese empire, about which I'm currently writing. An empire that is clearly a competitor of the United States, that is whose rulers are making hay, are crowing about the dysfunctions within American so-called liberal democracy. These are some of the trends with which you're familiar, and they are mostly threatening of monitory democracy wherever it exists on the face of the earth. But this book is defiant. It makes the case for rethinking the history of democracy. It tries to put on the table to heighten the sense of what is at stake in this period. And it asks the question, and on this I end, what's so good about democracy? Well, you all know that in villages and cities in countries such as Nigeria or Iran or Indonesia or Chile or Brazil, fancy philosophical argumentation doesn't count for much. What does democracy mean? As an ideal, it means uncorrupted, competent government. It means clean running water. It means electricity, vaccines, decent schools, no violence. What the book says, acknowledging that point, is, however, it's important to return to fundamentals. to ask that old question, what is so good about democracy? The answer, surprisingly, is that most of the received justifications of democracy are no longer plausible. For instance, the view that democracy is a God-given ideal was typically a Protestant notion. That's bad news for Muslims and for Jains and for Buddhists, for Catholics and others. What I tried to say in this book, and on this note I conclude, is that democracy is the friend of plural ideals and ways of life. It is the protector of our being on this planet. It is the protector of the biomes in which we dwell and upon which we depend. A precautionary redefinition of democracy is proposed. To put it in plain English, what is so good about monitory democracy? Monitory democracy is a global ideal because it is a means of damage prevention. It's a reality check on unrestrained power. When democracy takes root, when these various mechanisms function and function well, they prevent people who are in charge from straying into cuckoo land, where misadventures of power are camouflaged by fine words and lies, bullshit, and silence. I would say this is a global ideal. If you don't accept it, then the onus is on you to explain why it is that concentrated power always gets things right, that concentrated power can produce good kings and queens. Running through this book is a deep skepticism of that position, and a case is made for the dispersion of power, but above all, the public accountability of power wherever it is exercised, whether in the household all the way through to the battlefield. But I think this is enough to summarize just in a few words the shortest history of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for this fascinating account narrative of democracy. I think in less than 40 minutes, you just gave us this is the shortest history of democracy, even shorter than your book. It takes much less than that one to go through it. So let me start by asking a few questions which from the very beginning I was thinking about. So when we talk about history, history is about learning by experience. History is about learning from errors, correcting the errors of the past. So if you look at the history of democracy, I mean, you took us through assembly democracy, representative democracy, monitory democracy, and all its transformations, or the morphing or metamorphosis, if you like. What is it that we have learned? What are the mistakes that human beings, that human societies have made so far and have gotten us to where we are right now? I mean, if you were going to judge by the past few decades, we've had in the United Kingdom the Brexit, we've had Trump in the United States, recently we've got Boris Johnson in the UK, we've had Putin, and in Iran, for example, we've got almost a complete decline of the very idea of governance in the state. Everything is in complete chaos. What is it that we have learned and what is it that we have not learned, which is giving us this bleak picture of democracy?
It's a very important question, Dariush, and it's true that running through the book, there are observations about the recurrent traps and pitfalls that Democrats of the past were confronted by, and some of which are today confronting us and actually are deeply threatening of the spirit and the substance of democracy. What are these? Very briefly, a small handful of recurrent themes. First, not in any order of importance, first to do with property. when the pursuit of wealth becomes an end in itself, when this process of the accumulation of wealth results in the concentration of wealth and the propertylessness of millions of people, then the spirit and substance of democracy is threatened. The classical Greeks knew that in Athens. As I try to explain in the book, there were restraints on the accumulation of wealth. There were taxes. There was no pursuit of a sort of consumer capitalism. And indeed, politics was always understood in the Athenian case as a higher form of life than the orikos, the economy. So economic life was what took place in the household. Women giving birth to children, nurturing children, slaves doing the necessaries of life, cooking and cleaning and so on. But the higher form of life was politics, was being a citizen, of course, male citizen. The Greeks understood that what would later come to be called capitalism was incompatible with democracy. And today, I would say we are again faced with that problem, that in the last 40 years, there has been an almost unprecedented acceleration of the gap between rich and poor. Secondly, under modern conditions, electoral democracy confronted a territorial state system that actually was prone to war. Warlike states, war-making states, are a grave danger to democracy. The problem of war, the problem of forms of state power that crush democracy remains a problem in our day, and it was one that haunted and dragged down electoral democracy in its second phase. This book also points out the recurrent problem of what came to be called populism. You know, in every known form of democracy, I say, there was a kind of autoimmune disease observable. That is, if democracy is self-government of a people, then there's always a danger within any existing form of democracy that a leader or a party will appear that claims to know what the people want, claims to speak on behalf of the people, acts on behalf of the people. They become demagogues. There was antidotes to what came to be called populism in the 19th century. And again, we're experiencing a new wave of it in our times. For example, in Athens, there was a mechanism, very nice mechanism called ostrakismos, ostracism. So annually, a vote is taken to decide who is the most popular citizen. And that citizen, in a kind of unpopularity contest, is dispatched out of the polity, sent into exile because of the fear that that demagogue, the Pericles of the polity, that demagogue will threaten the democracy with a kind of despotic power. That populism is again with us. It's the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Dutertes and the Johnsons and so on. Finally, something new in the history of democracy, which is deeply threatening of all actually existing monitory democracies, I try to say in the book, is the destruction that we are unleashing on our planet's biosphere. One of the really novel things about democracy in our time, Dariush, is not only that there are signs of a rising anxiety about the unsustainability of the human species on our planet Earth that would drag down democracy and render it useless and to destroy it. But there is also a counter trend where there is an attempt, so to say, to extend the franchise to democracy, to extend the right of representation of our biomes in human affairs. And I mentioned various mechanisms that are unique to the age of monitory democracy. In those innovations, I think, lies hope for democracy. So yes, recurrent problems, challenges, contradictions, and a history of democracy where there are attempts to find solutions to each of these, this handful of tensions.
So this brings me to the other question, which is kind of interrelated, but I've just put a question mark before what I'm going to use, because you mentioned something about property in the pursuit of wealth. So the way I see it, democracy can work within a capitalist system. It can work within a communist/socialist system. It can work among Muslims. I don't think it can work with Islam or with Christianity or atheism, because I'm talking about agents. But then the question is runs a little bit deeper than this. When these systems, these hosts, if you like, engage with democracy with open arms, does it change them? What I'm saying is that we've got a method of governance, we've got a style of governance, which can eventually change the agents. Then a pre-democratic socialism, a pre-democratic communism, a pre-democratic capitalism, a pre-democratic Muslim society would be fundamentally different from a post-democratic one. It changes something in their genes, if you like. Does it do this to them, or are we too optimistic about it, or are we unrealistic about how we see democracy?
Well, it's again a really central question and a really difficult question to answer very simply, Dariusz. I would say in just a couple of handfuls of sentences that the problem of modern capitalism and democracy is a problem that first appears in the age of electoral democracy, electoral or representative democracy. And it became a really pressing question during the course of the 19th century. It's a very complicated history, that relationship of democracy, electoral democracy and capitalism. But it became really a bloody tension built into the very dynamics of the struggle for one person, one vote. It is a complicated history in which the rise of capitalism actually laid the foundations for some parts of electoral democracy. For example, the whole idea of taxation, no taxation without representation, is a product of the Low Countries, of what is today Netherlands, Belgium, for example. And it happened in cities like Amsterdam and Antwerp, where creditor capitalists made the point that they would not lend money to the emerging princes, to state builders, unless they were given parliamentary representation. That was the only way, according to them, of securing their capital. So there is, in that equation, democracy and capitalism, there is a very complicated set of dialectics. It's not all a one way where capitalism, the rise of capitalism steamrollers electoral democracy. But in the course of the 19th century, you don't have to have read any Marx to see that the industrial factory system was crushing of labor. It was deeply damaging of millions of people's lives, and it gave birth to what came to be called the social question. Put simply, in that period, 19th, early 20th centuries, in the age of electoral democracy, the demand was made for the right to a free trade union, the right not to be exploited in factories, the refusal of child labor, and the demand for, an 8-hour working day, and then later the demand for pensions and unemployment insurance and so on. There was a certain civilizing or taming of capitalism that democracy brought to the whole modern system of capitalist investment, production, and exchange. We are living in times where that problem, but in new guise, is again pressing. The lessons from the past apply to today, when, as has happened in the last 40 years of neoliberalism, when markets are allowed to be deregulated, the gap between rich and poor grows. Middle classes eventually feel anxious. Bubbles develop. Busts happen, 2008, and surely more to come. And this degradation of social solidarity that happens when capitalism is unregulated destroys the ethos of democracy, because after all, democracy is about dignity, shared dignity, and equality of people. But it also is having, unregulated capitalism is having clear damaging effects on our biosphere. One last thing to say is that we're living in times where an alternative model of capitalism, it's a form of state capitalism with Chinese characteristics, is becoming globally important. And this is a new dynamic, I would say, that is going to shape and define the future of democracy.
Okay, this brings me to now, the question I'm going to ask you is essentially coming from the title of your big book, The Life and Death of Democracy, because there's an ominous tone to it. Now, in the 18th century, when Immanuel Kant was writing this essay for the idea of universal history and the cosmopolitan aim, he's got this famous sentence that later on Isaiah Berlin chose it as a title of his book: "From such crooked timber as humankind is made of nothing entirely straight can be made." So this, of course, there are common themes in it which are found in history, which are found in religion, in the myth of creation. It also reminds me strangely of this new series which was made, The Westworld, about these human beings there was an earlier version of it also in Britain, but this was an American one. Now, my question is this, that we are talking about the idea of democracy, we're giving it to human beings, and these human beings, we talked about the contingencies of human beings. These human beings regularly keep corrupting the idea. It is corruption born of how human beings are actually exercising their agency. Not all good things come out of humanity all the time. So here's a question that I've got. I mean, is it an optimistic view of the human agent? Is it a pessimistic view of the human agent? Because if you look at that crooked timber of humanity, there's a very clear tone of pessimism in it. If you look at it differently, saying eventually truth will prevail, and humanity will have justice, humanity will have equality, humanity will bring happiness and development and equality to the rest of the world, it is optimistic. Where do you think the narrative of democracy that you've given us locates itself? Is it optimistic? Is it positivistic, pessimistic, or is it somewhere in between? Or is it constantly in suspension?
I like this question very much because it touches on a theme that runs through the shortest history of democracy, Dariush. Where I say that, I only hinted at it in my earlier comments, where I say that in the past, democracy was praised through some grand ideals, narratives, stories that were told that said it was, a recipe for paradise on earth. For instance, the view that democracy would bring truth into the world. John Stuart Mill was among those who thought in this way. Or utilitarians, English utilitarians talked in terms of the happiness principle, that the greatest happiness of the greatest number would be an effect of parliamentary democracy, with a few prisons, of course. Or we've seen a flourishing in our times of talk of humanity, the whole human rights discourse, that humanity, being human, is an ideal after which we should strive. What I say in the book is that all of these grand ideals, these grand narratives that were used to justify democracy in the past, are unconvincing. Some of them are outright false. And the question then becomes, okay, can we value democracy for other reasons? Are there good reasons why being attached to the ideal of democracy as self-government of flesh and blood people who consider themselves as equals, who refuse bossing and bullying, who are skeptical and resistant to arbitrary power? Are there reasons for thinking that democracy in this sense is even a universal ideal? Well, what I say in the book, quoting a couple of key characters, is the answer is yes. And the answer as to why democracy is to be considered in these years of the 21st century a universal ideal has to do with your point. It has to acknowledge your point that humans have this remarkable capacity to corrupt and denigrate one another and, of course, the wider world in which they dwell. Here, I, towards the end of the book, make reference to two characters whom our audience may not have heard of. Lin Yutang was one of the great writers of Republican China in the 1930s. My Country, My People was a bestseller. It appeared in English, where Lin Yutang says, the good thing about democracy, the really good thing about democracy, is that it supposes that people are capable of being crooks. And that is why we have periodic elections to throw the rascals out. And that is why we have laws and we have institutions like independent courts and a free press. And later he would see other public monitoring bodies to prevent the crooked timber of humanity from so to say, getting out of hand. The other character is the Catholic writer C.S. Lewis, who in the darkest moment of World War II wrote an essay on democracy, whose spirit and substance I like very much and runs throughout my book. C.S. Lewis, famous as a children's writer, among other texts, asked the question, what's so good about democracy? Well, he says that it's been said in the past that people are so good that they're capable of governing themselves and that they don't need monarchs or tyrants, dictators, or fascist demagogues to tell them what to do. C.S. Lewis said, actually, none of this is true. None of that reasoning is true, because we are living in times when we can see that people can be dastardly to another. They torture, they kill, they maim, they drop bombs on others. And so C.S. Lewis drew the inference, flipping things over, as it were, in which he says, the reason I'm a Democrat is because nobody on earth is good enough to rule others. That is, nobody is entitled to enjoy power arbitrarily. And this reasoning, it seems to me, is of fundamental importance in our times. And of course, it is a view that can be aligned with the belief in a deity or deities. One of the striking things, and I hope readers will find surprising things in this book, is that secular democracy, in the French sense of laïcité, only enjoyed, if that is the right word, popularity for a very brief period. All throughout its history, the idea of democracy as self-government of peoples who are equals has been aligned with, bound up with notions of people being dependent upon and taking their cues from a god or gods. That's true for the classical Greek democracies, as it's true for most of the electoral democracies in phase 2 of the history of democracy. And it remains true until today, that the spiritual can be and is very often an ally of democracy in this sense. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who recently passed away, is an instance of that. He believed in democracy, not because he thought people were angels on earth, but because people could be dangerous to others on earth. And he called upon a god to sanction, so to say, that revised understanding of democracy as a means of preventing scoundrels from bringing great damage to humans.
Thank you for that eloquent response. So we've run out of time, but I've got one small question, sort of on the back of the earlier question that we had. So I'm going to summarize it very quickly, and I would like a very quick answer. I understand that because of the ungodly hour at which I'm doing this. I mean, for the Southern Hemisphere, it looks okay, but for the North Americans and for the Europeans, it's a very strange hour. But that's why we don't have too many questions from the audience. So here's a question. From what I get, is it true that at its lowest moments, democracy has risen again more powerfully and more creatively? I mean, when it's been under attack, I mean, I think we all acknowledge that in our contemporary world today, democracy is going through a massive crisis. But if we argue that democracy at its lowest moments again has risen, isn't there a kind of a religious tone to it, that we believe in democracy? Isn't democracy turning into a kind of a creed, something that we have faith in, as if we have faith in God, as if we have replaced God in a sense with democracy? It's as if God is spoken through the tongue of democracy. And here's what I would end.
Yes, that's not the way that this book approaches the subject of the future of democracy in these darkening times. There are no historical guarantees or let's say metaphysical guarantees of its future success. Instead, the idea that runs through this book is that the powerful, wherever they may be, in corporations, in states, in cross-border institutions, the powerful in a household, think of a bullying husband of his partner and children, that the powerful are vulnerable to uncertainty, to surprises, that the powerful can perforce be put on a tightrope and made to walk across that tightrope suspended in the air by events, by people organizing against their bullying and their violence. In this respect, there are no historical guarantees of democracy. It's not God-given. It's not a natural substance. It is not coterminous with the human condition. But its spirit can be reborn, and it can undergo a regeneration, a reimagination, as it did several times in its history. That, I think, is one of the central points to grasp that is developed in this book. We are living in times where catastrophism, the belief that the world is coming to an end, should be refused, but where the opposite, naive optimism, should also be refused. Possibilism is the true friend of democracy. And again, the one thing that the spirit and substance of democracy has going for it is the argument, the proposition, the notion that concentrated power is dangerous power. When power is not publicly accountable and restrained, it can bring great evils to the world. That, at least, is a central proposition that's put on the table, as it were, by this book.
Thank you very much, John, for this very fascinating narrative of the book and the exhilarating discussion that you offered for us today. So I'm going to bring this to an end. I would like to express my gratitude to John for finally allowing us this time and the space and this different time difference between the South and the North hemisphere of the world. This discussion will be available on YouTube as well. I'll make the entire file of the discussion and the earlier talk that John Keane made available on YouTube, so you can watch it at your own pace when the time is right, when you don't have to wake up very early in the morning or very late in the evening, depending on where you are. And thank you to all who joined me, and I'll see you next time for another discussion with probably John Keane or somebody else.